Alright, welcome to the Learning College here. Today we're going to read a classic that should have been done a long time ago. And I decided I needed to do it because there's so much relevancy to this book that will apply and hopefully inspire people in today's time. This is called For My Legionaries. This is an autobiography by the leader of Iron Guard, which was a Romanian fascist organization from the 1920s and 1930s, started by Mr. Codreanu. This is an autobiography, and I will be starting now. This is the introduction to the Legionaries. December 6th, 1935, Canon Silva. Legionaries. I write for our legionary family, for all legionaries, those in villages, in factories, and in the university. I do not pay attention to any regulation imposed on book authors. I have no time. I write hastily on the battlefield, and in the midst of attacks. At this hour we are surrounded on all sides. The enemies strike us treacherously, and treason bites us. For 2 years we have been bound by the chains of an infamous censorship. For 2 years our name and that of legionary are tolerated by the press only to be insulted. A rain of treacheries is heaped upon us while our enemies applaud and hope that we shall perish. But these knights of cowardice, as well as their masters, will be convinced, in fact soon, that all the attacks in which they pool their hopes of destroying the legionary movement, all their agitation and desperate efforts, will remain fruitless. Legionaries do not die. Erect, immovable, invincible, and immortal, they look forever victorious over the impotent convulsions of hatred. The opinion created in the non-legionary world by the lines that follow is of no consequence to me, and their effects upon that world does not interest me. What I want is that you, soldiers of other Romanian horizons, while reading these recollections, recognize in them your own past and remember your battles. That you relive the suffering you endured and the blows you took for our people. That you fill your hearts with fire and stand firm in the difficult and righteous struggle in which you are engaged and out of which we all have the command to emerge either victorious or dead. I think of you as I write. Of you who will have to die, receiving the baptism of death with the serenity of our ancestral Thracians. And of you, those who will have to step over the dead in their tombs, carrying in your hands the victorious banners of the Romanians. Alright, now we start chapter 1 in the Dobrina forest. Here we are, congregated one afternoon in the spring of 1919, in the Dobrina forest, which stands sentinel on the heights around Husi. Who? A group of around 20 high school students, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. I called these young comrades together to discuss a grave problem, though our life was but budding. What are we going to do if the Bolsheviks invade us? My opinion, with which the others were in accord, was this. If the Bolshevik army crosses the Dniester, then the Pruth, reaching our region, we shall not submit, but we shall take refuge in the woods armed. We will organize there a center of Romanian action and resistance, and by skillful action shake up the enemy. We will maintain a spirit of non-submission and keep alive a spark of hope amidst the Romanian masses in villages and towns. We all took an oath in the middle of the ancient forest. This forest was a corner of that famous woods of Tigiciu, on whose paths, throughout Moldova's history, many an enemy found death. We decided to acquire weapons and ammunition, to maintain total secrecy, to engage in reconnoitering and battle exercises there in the forest, and to establish a front which would mask our intentions. We easily found this front, and we soon brought it into being a cultural national association of the students at the high school of Husi, which we named Mihail Kogalnicianu. It was approved by the high school principal. Then we began get-togethers and lectures in town. We treated the customary subjects in public, while in the woods we simulated battle exercises. In those tints, one could find weapons everywhere, so that within about 2 weeks we collected all we needed. There was then such a chaotic state of affairs in the country that we, though but children hardly over 18 years of age, understood all too well. Everybody was thinking about the Bolshevik Revolution, which was well underway, only a few steps over the border. The peasantry was opposed to this destroying wave out of instinct, but completely disorganized, could not put up a serious resistance. But industrial workers were vertigiноusly sliding towards communism, being systematically fed the cult of these ideas by the Jewish press, and generally by the entire Jewry of the cities. Every Jew, merchant, intellectual, or banker capitalist in his radius of activity was an agent of these anti-Romanian revolutionary ideas. The Romanian intelligentsia was undecided, the state apparatus disorganized. One could expect at any moment either an internal eruption of some determined and organized elements or an invasion from over the Dniester. This external action, coordinated with that of Judeo-communist bands within, who could bear down on us, destroying bridges and blowing up stores of ammunition, would have then decided our fate as a people. It was in such circumstances, our thoughts in turmoil, worrying about life and liberty and our country, just unified at the end of a difficult war, that our youthful minds, the idea that led us to the oath in the Dobrina forest, germinated. I had had 5 years at the military academy in Monasteria de la Luli, where the head of Michael the Brave reposes under the searching eye of Nicolae Filipescu, who was a former cabinet member and a founder of the military academy. There, under the orders of Maj, later Colonel Mariel Olteanu, the school's commandant, that of Captain Virgil Badulescu of Lut, Emil Palangiano, and under the guidance of the professors, I received a strict soldierly education and a healthy confidence in my own powers. In fact, my military education will be with me all my life. Order, discipline, hierarchy, molded into my blood at an early age, along with the sentiment of soldierly dignity, will constitute a guiding thread for my entire future activity. Here, too, I was taught to speak little, a fact which later was to lead me to hate, quote-unquote, chatterboxing, and too much talk. Here I learned to love the trench and to despise the drawing room. And that's something you see in these movements. A lot of people love to chatterbox. Few people want to actually do something effective to stop the enemy. I think this is a problem that inflicts mostly conservative-minded people who come from Republican voting backgrounds. You can tell, Codreanu is going to talk about this later, but you can definitely tell he has a lot of economically left leanings. And I think there is some notable association between people who are left-leaning in certain ways in terms of how fanatical they can get compared to more conservative-minded people. Alright, back to the book here. The notions of military science I was receiving then will make me later judge everything through the prism of this science. This cult of the sentiment of human and military dignity in which the officers brought me up was to create for me difficulties and expose me to suffering, in a world oftentimes lacking both honor and a sense of dignity. I spent the summer of 1916 at home in Husi. My father had been recalled into the military for the past 2 years and left with the regiment for the Carpathians. One night my mother woke me up and, crying and crossing herself, said, quote, "Wake up! All the bells of all the churches are ringing," unquote. It was August 15th, 1916, the Feast of St. Mary. I understood the mobilization had been decreed, and that at that moment the Romanian army had crossed the mountains. Seized by emotion, my whole body trembled. 3 days later, I left home to trail my father, pushed by my yearning that I, too, be among the fighters of the front. Finally, following many adventures, I reached the regiment in which my father was commanding a company, the 25th Infantry Regiment under the command of Colonel V. Piperescu, as it was advancing into Transylvania on the Otuis Valley. My misfortune was great, for being only 17 years old, the regimental commander turned me down as a volunteer. Yet I took part both in the advance into and the retreat from Transylvania, and on September 20th, when my father fell wounded above Sovada on the Saris-Domu mountain, I was useful to him ahead of the enemy's advance. Though wounded, he refused to be evacuated, leaving his company throughout the retreat, and later in the heavy fighting that followed at Oitz. At 2 o'clock one night, the regiment received orders to advance. The officers inspected their troops massed in a tomb-like quiet on the highway. My father was asked to report to the colonel. Returning after a short while, he told me, quote, "Would it not be better for you to go back home? We will soon be engaged in battle, and it is not good that both of us die here, for Mother Den is going to be left with 6 small children with no support." The colonel called me and told me that he does not want to take responsibility of your remaining here on the front, unquote. I could tell his heart was in doubt. He hesitated at leaving me alone in the middle of the night, out in the open on unfamiliar roads, 25 miles from the nearest railroad. Noting his insistence, however, I turned in my carbine and the 2 cartridge holders while the columns of the regiment moved on, disappearing into the quiet and darkness of night. I remained alone on the edge of a ditch, then started in the direction of the old frontier and home. When, a year later, on September 1st, I entered the military school of infantry at Botosani, the thought was still in my mind to be able to reach the front. Here I completed my education and military knowledge from September 1st, 1917 to July 17th of 1918 in the military school's active company. The 4 distinguished officers, Colonel Slavscu, Captain Suria, Lieutenant Florin Radulescu, and Maj Steflia, guided my steps in the ways of battle and sacrifice for my country. Another year passed. 1919 brought peace, and we, the children ready to die, were scattered, each to his home. My father, a teacher in secondary schools, had been a lifetime nationalist fighter. My grandfather was a forester. Likewise, my great-grandfather. The people of my nation have been from the very beginning, in any difficult historical times, a people of woods and mountains. That is why my soldierly upbringing and the blood in my veins impressed on the action at Dobrina, a naive manifestation, a note of seriousness which our tender age would not have presupposed. In those moments we felt in our heart, with their advice and experience, the presence of all our ancestors, who had fought for Moldavia on the same paths the enemies never penetrated. Okay, now we are on the second part of Chapter 1, called At the University of Iasi, September 1919. The summer passed. I took basically his version of the diploma, because I'm going to butcher this if I try to say that, in the fall, and our group parted ways, each directing his steps towards university. From Dobrino, we retained only the memories of defending our country against the waves of enmity menacingly raised both from without and from within our borders. I was leaving Husi at this crossroad for every youth, the enrollment into a university, the long-awaited enrollment at the university. As preparation, I had the capital of knowledge acquired in high school, sensational literature, or that of spiritual perversion which today occupies such an important place in the formative years of a high schooler whose misfortune I have not tasted. In addition to the customary literature of the Romanian classics, I had read all the articles in the Seminatural and Nimul Romansic. This translates to the Sour and the Romanian People, of N. Iorga and A.C. Cuza. My father had these in some boxes in the attic. That is where I climbed in my free hours to busy myself with such literature. The essence of these articles contained the expression in a high form of the three ideals of life for the Romanian people. 1. The unification of the Romanian people. 2. The elevation of peasantry through land reform and political rights. 3. The solution to the Jewish problem. There were two maxims printed on the jackets of all nationalistic publications of that time. Quote, Romania of the Romanians, only of the Romanians, and of all Romanians, unquote, by N. Iorga. And another quote here, nationality is the creative power of human culture. Culture is the creative power of nationality, unquote, by A.C. Cuza. I approached Iasi with great reverence. The Iasi loved and understood by every Romanian, the city everybody at least wants to visit. Many towns in Moldavia have some fragment of glory. We cannot pronounce the names, Hotin, Barlad, Veslui, Tichina, Sedati, Alba, Soroka, without feeling our souls uplifted. But above all these rise Suceava and Iasi. Suceava, the fortress of Stefan the Great, and Iasi, the city of Cuza Voda, the city of the Union of 1859, which through the founding of the university became the city of youth and that of its noblest aspirations. In Iasi lived Miran Kostin, Bodan Petriescu, Hastu, Mihail Imnescu, Iron Krienga, Vasil Alexandri, Ostache Negri, Iacob Negruzi, Mihail Kulgan Nasianu, Sitnion Barnutiu, Vasil Kanta, and Iorga Ion Gavinskul. And I apologize for butchering these names. I'm not Romanian. I wish I could understood the language, but I don't, and no one else wanted to do it, so I'm trying my best. Here, like a lighthouse, shines in political economy the greatest personality of Professor Cuza. The university became a school of nationalism. Iasi, the city of the great Romanian thrust forward, of our national greatness, ideals, and aspirations. It is great from the sorrow of 1917, when here in his troubled hours the tormented soul of King Ferdinand found refuge. Great through its destiny of being in 1918 the city of union of all Romanians. Great by virtue of its great past, and great by its present tragedy, for the city of the 40 churches dies daily forgotten under the merciless Jewish invasion, Iasi, like Rome, built on 7 hills, is and remains the eternal city of Romanianism. How many glorious memories. Here were heard for the first time, resounding, those harmonious verses of Alexandria. Quote, Romanians of every feather, come, let us join hands together. Unquote. Here, as nowhere else, the student feels hovering in the air over silent Iasi, with their mysterious appeals and their sacred urgings, the spirits of our ancestors. The Iasi student, in the quiet of the night, hears, as if maddened by pain, the phantom of Mihail Eminescu running through the tortuous streets of the city, moaning like a ghost. Quote, he who takes strangers to heart, may the dogs eat his heart. May the waste eat his home. May ill fame devour his folks. Unquote. This is the town I was approaching with profound reverence in the fall of 1919, being attracted by its great aura, but moved also because it was here that I was born 20 years earlier. And just like any child, I was moved again to see and kiss my native earth. I registered in the School of Law. Iasi University, closed during the war years, had reopened a year earlier. The old students, returned now as veterans, retained the line of the traditional nationalism of student life before the war. They were divided into 2 camps, one under the leadership of Labuska from Letters, and another under that of Nelu Ionescu from Law. These groups, small in number, were overwhelmed by the immense mass of Jewish students coming over to school from Bessarabia, all communist agents and propagandists. The university's professors, excepting a very limited group headed by A.C. Cuza, Ion Gavinskul, and Corneliu Samulianu, were supporters of the same leftist ideas. Professor Paul Bourgeois, one of the majority's exponents, stated quite dearly in the country's full Senate, quote, the light comes from the east, namely, from beyond the Dniester. Such an attitude on the part of the professors who considered, quote-unquote, barbarous any nationalistic idea or note resulted in the total disorientation of the students, some openly supporting Bolshevism. Others, the greater part, saying, quote, say what you will, nationalism is passe, mankind moves toward the left, unquote. The Labushka group slipped totally in this direction. The Nelu Ionescu group, to which I adhered, scattered in time, following some elections in the university which they lost. The advancement of these anti-Romanian ideas, supported by a compact mass of professors and students, and encouraged by all enemies of unified Romania, found among the student body no Romanian resistance. A few of us who were still trying to man the barricades were surrounded by an atmosphere of scorn and enmity. On the streets or in the halls of the university, colleagues holding other opinions, those with, quote, freedom of conscience, unquote, and who preach every other kind of freedom, spat behind us as we passed and became increasingly aggressive. Thousands of students in meeting after meeting in which Bolshevism was propagated attacked army, justice, church, crown. There was only one association that yet maintained a Romanian character, quote, Avram Iacu, unquote, belonging to the Bukovinians and Transylvanians under the leadership of Vasil Ianshki, a student. The university, traditionally nationalistic since the 1860s, became a nest of anti-Romanianism. And now we're on the next part of the chapter here, revolution being prepared. But it was not wholly in the university that the situation existed. Iasi's massive working men, almost entirely immersed in communism, was at the ready to erupt in the revolution. Little work was done in factories. Hours on end they held meetings and councils, mostly about politics rather than work. We found ourselves systematically sabotaged, according to plan and by command. Quote, break, destroy machinery, create the state of general material misery, which leads to the eruption of revolution, unquote. And indeed, the more this command was obeyed, the more the misery spread. Hunger threatened menacingly, and rebellion grew in the soul of the multitudes. Every 3 or 4 days on the streets of Iasi, there were huge communist demonstrations. Those 10 to 15,000 starved workers maneuvered by the Judaic criminal hand from Moscow paraded the streets while singing the Internationale, yelling, quote, down with the king, down with the army, and carrying placards on which one could read, quote, long live the communist revolution, unquote, and another quote, long live Soviet Russia, unquote. If these had been victorious, would we have had at least a Romania led by Romanian workers' regime? Would the Romanian workers have become the masters of the country? No. The next day, we would have become the slaves of the dirtiest tyranny, the Talmudic Jewish tyranny. Greater Romania, after just than a second of existence, would have collapsed. We, the Romanian people, would have been mercilessly exterminated, killed, or deported throughout Siberia. Peasants, workers, intellectuals, all pell-mell. The land from Maramuresh to the Black Sea, snatched from Romanian hands, would have been colonized by Jewish masses. Here, it is that they would have built up their true Palestine. I was perfectly aware that in those hours the life and death of the Romanian people was at stake, and so were the Jews who were pushing the Romanian workers into revolution. They had no sympathy with the anguish which gripped our hearts in those moments, or with the anxiety betrayed in our eyes. They knew what they were doing. Only the Romanian intellectuals were unconscious. Intellectuals who had gone to school and were supposed to enlighten the people in difficult times, for that is why they were intellectuals, were absent from their duty. These unworthy beings in those decisive moments maintained with a criminal unconsciousness that, quote, the light comes from the east, unquote. Who was to oppose the revolutionary columns which marched menacingly through the streets of our towns? The students? No. The intelligentsia? No. The police? No. These, when hearing the columns approach, panicked and vanished. Not even the military could bar their way, for one did not talk of 1,000 men, but of 15,000, of 20,000, organized and hungry. At the next part of the chapter here, the Guard of the National Conscious. One rainy evening in the fall of 1919, in the mess hall of the School of Arts and Crafts, where I was a counselor, a friend of mine showed me a newspaper notice. The Guard of the National Conscious holds a meeting this evening, Thursday, 9 o'clock, number 3, Alexandria Street. Quote unquote, that's what it said on the newspaper notice. I left immediately, running with great impatience to know and to enroll in this organization, whose anti-communist flyers I had read several months earlier. In the room on number 3 Alexandria Street, set up with newly made benches, I found only one man already there. He was about 40, brawny, and downcast, sitting at a table, waiting for people to come. A big head, 2 strong arms, heavy fists, of middle stature. He was Constantin Pancu, the president of the Guard of the National Conscious. I introduced myself, telling him I was a student, that I wished to be admitted as a fighter into the Guard. He accepted me. I sat in at that meeting. About 20 persons came, a typesetter, Voinescu, a student, about 4 mechanics from RMS, let's see what RMS means here. Oh, so RMS was the security service of Romania prior to the communist takeover. Several questions were discussed in connection with the momentum gained by the communist movement in various factories and part of the city, and with the problem of organizing the guard. From that evening on, my road bifurcated. One half in the fight at the university, the other half with Constantin Pancu among the workers. I became attached to this man, and I stood with him under his leadership constantly, until the organization disbanded. And this is the next part of the chapter here, Constantin Pancu. So it says here, Constantin Pancu, whose name was on the lips of all Aisans in both camps, uttered hopefully by Romanians, in horror by the others, was not an intellectual. He was a tradesman, plumber and electrician. He never went beyond 4 primary grades. He had a lucid, balanced mind, which he himself enriched with adequate knowledge. For 20 years he had been occupied with workers' problems. He had been for several years the president of the Metallurgical Union. He was a first-class speaker. At the podium before a crowd, he was impressive. He had a soul and a conscience that were clearly Romanian. He loved his country, the military, the king. A good Christian, he had the muscles of a circus fighter, and force truly Herculean. Aisans had known him for a long time. Before the war, a circus came to Aisi which held fighting shows. There were among the combatants men from all nations, Hungarians, Turks, Romanians, Russians, etc. One evening, when one of them won over all the other fighters, from among the spectators, a citizen stood up asking to fight the winner. He was permitted to do so. He undressed and the fight started. In 2 minutes, the Hungarian circus strongman was thrown to the ground, defeated. The Romanian who won, amidst the crowd's enthusiastic admiration, was none other than Constantin Pancu. That is why, when his call to battle appeared for the first time on the streets of Aisi, the public which worshipped strength accepted it with trust. His effort lasted 1 year, increasing as the Bolshevik menace grew, then decreasing as it diminished. Small meetings were held at first, then rallies that reached 5, 6, even 10,000 people. These took place weekly during the critical period of the Prince Mircea Hall, or sometimes in Union Square. Among those who regularly spoke was myself. This is where I learned how to speak before a crowd. Undeniably, the guard of the national conscience raised the conscience of Romanians at a critical time, an important place as that of Aisi, and placed it like a barrier before the communist wave. This activity, however, was not limited only to Aisi. We went to other towns. In addition, the paper Constanța, which means the conscious, was regularly published, penetrated with its cry of alarm into nearly all the towns of Moldavia and Bessarabia. Almost daily out in the field between the 2 camps, inevitable bloody clashes occurred, our side sustaining the most wounded. This tense situation lasted until spring, but after 2 great victories for our side, the offensive power of our adversaries was much reduced. Next part of the chapter here, the occupation of the agency of state monopolies by the Guard of the National Conscience. It was either on the 10th or 11th of February 1920. For 2 weeks there had been talk of a nationwide general strike. The decisive battle was approaching. It was rumored in town that around noon at DASM, where about 1,000 workers were employed, the strike was declared. The red flag raised, the king's picture lowered and trampled underfoot, being then replaced by those of Karl Marx, Trotsky, and Rakowski. 2 of those 3 are definitely Jews. I'm sure that Rakowski is as well. I just wanted to point that out to the reader. Our people there were beaten. The mechanics, member of the guard, wounded. At 1 o'clock, about 1,000 of us got there together at our headquarters. What to do? Panku chaired the discussion. There were two opinions. Some claimed we should send telegrams to the government requesting military intervention. My opinion was that those present should head for the ASM and tear down the red flag at any risk. My point of view was agreed upon. We took our flag, and at 1 o'clock, led by Panku, we started marching on Codreanu and Pecurari, singing Destapate Romani, which means, Awaken, ye Romanian. Close to the factory in the street, we broke up several groups of communists. We entered the factory's courtyard and went into the building, carrying the flag oil the way to the roof, where I planted it. From there, I gave a talk. The military appeared and occupied the factory. We retreated singing, then returned to our headquarters, considering our rapid incursion a success. The news of our attitude flashed through the town like lightning. Yet the strike continued. The military could only defend the flag. It could not make the plant run. What was to be done? An idea occurred to us to search the city for workers in order to open the plant. In 3 days, 400 new workers gathered from all quarters of Iasi entered the plant. This began to run. The strike had failed. 2 weeks later, half the strikers demanded that they be returned to work. Our victory was great. The first step toward the general strike was rejected. The plans of the Judeo-Communist consortium began to be frustrated. Our action had a resounding echo within the Romanian ranks, raising their morale. Next part of the chapter here, the tricolor flag over the Nicolina works. The most powerful communist center was formed by the Romanian railway works at Nicolina. Over 4,000 men worked there, nearly all Bolshevized. Residential areas around these works, Podil-Ras, Sokola, and Nicolina, were invaded by a considerable number of Jews. That is why the leader of the communist movement in Iasi, Dr. Gellerter and his aide Geller, fixed their point of resistance here. A month had not passed since their defeat at ASM, and as a signal to begin the general strike and the decisive battle, the red flag was hoisted, fluttering over the works. A strike was declared. Thousands of workers were pouring out. The authorities were powerless. Through flyers, we convoked all Romanians to a meeting in the Prince Mercia Hall. After the speeches, we left the building with our flags, and the whole crowd headed for Nicolina. In Union Square, we were stopped by the authorities, who advised us against continuing, for there were over 5,000 armed communists there waiting for us, and much bloodshed would take place. So, we turned from Union Square toward the railway station, where we hoisted flags over the engine roundhouse and over the station. Then we commandeered a train on the track and went to Nicolina. Some went through the switch in the Nicolina station and train, and all entered the Nicolina works. We got off. In the shops, no one. On one of the buildings, the red flag. I climbed up a fire escape holding a tricolor flag between my teeth. With some difficulty, for it was at a great height, I reached the top. I got on the roof and I reached the rope. Sorry, this PDF is not 100% correct here. There's some mistakes. So I reached the rope. I got on the top and I reached the rope. I got on the roof and crawled to the top. I snatched the red flag, and amidst the truly tremendous hurrahs, lasting several minutes, I hoisted and secured the tricolor flag. Then from there I spoke. Outside the walls, the communists, increasing in numbers, steadily grew into a compact mass and demonstrated menacingly. An infernal racket. Inside, harassy. Outside, booze and cursing. Then I slowly descended to the ground. Panku ordered our departure. but at the gate the communists barred our exit, yelling, quote, "Let Panku and Codreanu come forward," unquote. We stepped 30 yards in front of the crowd and headed for the gate. In the middle, Panku on his right, a tradesman, Marguerite with myself on the left. All three of us advanced, saying nothing, keeping our hands in our pockets on the revolvers. Those at the gate watched us, quiet and unmoving. Now we were but a few steps away. I expected the whiz of a bullet going past my ear. But we kept on, straight and determined. However, this was an unusual, soulful moment. We were now but a couple steps away. The communists stepped aside, opening up for us. For about 10 yards, we walked in tomb-like silence through their mist. We looked neither to the left nor the right. Nothing was heard, not even human breathing. Our men followed us, but as they came through, the silence was broken. Cursing began, with threats on both sides, but nobody fighting. In a body, we headed along the railroad toward the station. Behind us, over the works, the blowing wind fluttered the cloth of the victorious tricolor. The moral effect of this action was incomparable. The whole of Ayasi was in an uproar. Everybody on the streets spoke only about the guard of the national conscience. A current Romanian awakening was felt in the air. The trains carried further to the four corners of the country the news of this resurrection. We realized that Bolshevism would be defeated because facing it, as well as on its flanks, a barrier of conscience had been raised which would prevent its expansion. All roads to its further encroachment were now closed. From now on we must retreat. Not long after, action by Getty. Averescu's administration was added to our efforts, enough so that this movement's prospects were altogether nullified. Alright, now we're on to the next part of Chapter 1. National Christian Socialism, the National Syndicates. The Guard of the National Conscience was a fighting organization designed to knock out the enemy. I was talking with Panku many times those evenings in 1919, for we were together constantly and almost regularly ate at his table. And I was telling him, quote, "It is not enough to defeat communism. We must also fight for the rights of the workers. They have a right to bread and a fight to honor. We must fight against the oligarchic parties, creating national workers' organizations which can gain their rights within the framework of the state and not against the state." Unquote. And there's another quote here. It says, "We permit no one to try raising on Romanian soil another flag, save that of our national history. No matter how," and this is misspelled in the PDF file, it says HGBT, "no matter how HGBT the workers' class may be." Not really sure what he was trying to get at there. Something along the lines of, no matter how bad it is for the workers. I assume that's what he's trying to say. "We do not tolerate that it rise up against the country or that it make common cause with foreign movements outside our borders. No one will admit that for your bread you lay waste and band over into the bands of a foreign people of bankers and usurers everything that for 2 millennia the sweat of a people of workers and brave ones has saved. Your rights, yes, but within the rights of your people. It is inadmissible that for your right, the historic right of the nation to which you belong, be trampled underfoot. But we will neither admit that in the shelter of the color formulas an oligarchic and tyrannical class may install itself on the backs of workers of all categories and literally skin them, while continually waving banners through the air for fatherland which they do not love, God in whom they do not believe, church into which they never enter, an army which they sent to war empty-handed." Unquote. And there's another quote here. "These are realities which cannot be used as false emblems for political fraud in the hands of some immoral Prestigators, unquote. Then we began organizing the workers in the national unions and even wrote a political party, quote, the National Christian Socialism. It was then that Pankow wrote, and this is the next section of the chapter, the Creed of National Christian Socialism, which says here, I believe in the one and undivided Romanian state, from the Dniester to the Tisa, the holder of all Romanians and only of Romanians, lover of work, honor, and in fear of God, concerned about the country and its people, giver of equal rights, both civil and political, to men and to women, protector of the family, paying its public servants. At the same time, we had not heard of Adolf Hitler and German National Socialism and workers on the basis of the number of children and the work performed, quality and quantity, and in a state supporter of social harmony through minimizing of class differences, and in addition to salaries, nationalizing factories, and distributing the land among all the plowmen. It would distribute benefits between owner, state and private, and workers. The former owner, in addition to his own salary, should get a percentage inversely proportional to the size of his original investment. Furthermore, the state would insure his original investment. Furthermore, the state would insure the workers through a risks fund, would provide storehouses for food and clothing for workers and civil servants who, organize the national unions, will have their representatives in the administrative boards of the various industrial, agricultural, and commercial institutions. I believe in a great and strong father of the workers and king of the peasants, Ferdinand I, who has sacrificed all for the happiness of Romania, and who, for our salvation, became as one with the people, who at the head of his troops, Amorazzi and Maracetti, vanquished the enemy, who ever since looks lovingly and trustingly upon the soldiers owing him allegiance, soldiers who will find their military duty to be a real school of their nation, which they can finish in a year. Quote, I believe in one tricolor surrounded by the rays of National Christian Socialism, symbol of harmony among the brothers and sisters of Greater Romania. I believe in one sacred Christian church, with priests living the gospel and for the gospel, and who would, like the apostles, sacrifice themselves for the enlightenment of the many. I recognize the election of the ministers by the chamber, the abolition of the Senate, the organization of rural police, a progressive income tax, schools of agriculture, and crafts in the villages, circles for housewives and adults, homes for invalids and old folks, national homes, the determination of paternity, effectively bringing the knowledge of the laws to anybody, the encouragement of private initiative in the interest of the nation, and the development of the peasants' home industry. I await the resurrection of national conscience even in the most humble shepherd, and the descent of the educated into the midst of the tired, to strain and help them in true brotherhood, the foundation of Romania tomorrow. Amen. Quote, the guard of national conscience. Unquote. And here we have, it says here, the newspaper Constanța de Conscience, Monday, February 9th, 1920. It says here, then we began the organization of the national unions. The following document shows how one of our unions was formed. I publish it in order to emphasize the conscientiousness of the Aizen workers at the time. Minutes. Quote, the underside tradesmen, workers, and clerks of the tobacco plant ASM met this evening, Monday, February 2nd of 1920, at the headquarters of the Guard of the National Conscience, number 3 Alexandria Street, under the chairmanship of Mr. C. Pankow, active president of the Guard. Whereas the criminal tendencies of certain individuals who serve interests that are foreign to this people, and whereas the propaganda in which they engage, namely to strike at the well-being of this institution and at the very existence of those who have been working all of our lives for a slice of bread, which is our only food and that of our children, we, honest and law-abiding Romanian workers, wishing to march united beneath the flag of our country, on the road dictated by the supreme interests of our people, for the well-being of this institution, in order to help stop once and for all the propaganda of our enemy within our ranks, decided to constitute ourselves into a professional national union, for which we elected the following committee and a delegate of the Guard of the National Conscience, unquote. There follow 183 signatures. The Conscience, February 9th, 1920, and that's the end of this section of the chapter. Alright, on to the next portion here. A truthful picture of the situation in 1919. I try to report the moment of 1919 and 1920, taking from newspapers and manifestos what I consider to be significant. The first manifesto, issued by Constantin Pancu at Iasi in August 1919, posted on the walls everywhere in Iasi, in a moment of general disorientation, is the signal to battle for the Romanian workers of Iasi. It says here, appeal to Romanian tradesmen, workers, soldiers, and peasants. Brothers, following years of frightful battles, the world celebrates peace among men. The wise leaders in all civilized countries endeavor to do away with war by establishing a law to guarantee a peaceful existence in the future. But lo, from the east one hears voices of hatred, which indicate the attempt of our enemies to rip us apart through discord and misunderstandings among us. From Russia, ruled by the darkness of erroneous teachings, we are urged to battle and fire and to kill our brothers of like blood. From Hungary, which weeps over her former grandeur, one hears the same urgings. The enemies in the east have united with those in the west to disturb our peace so they can invade us. The foreigners beyond our borders try to pass the cup of poison among us through the aliens living in the bosom of our country. They dare state that they brought us forward in the name of peace, justice, and liberty, and in the name of the workers. Their word is a lie, their urgings a killing poison, for they say they want peace, but they themselves destroy it, killing the most worthy. Demand freedom, but by death threats oblige people to submit to them. Wish brotherhood, while they sow hatred, injustice, and licentiousness within nations. Moreover, they say they want the abolishment of capital earned by the sweat of one's brow. They tell us they do not want war, but they want war. They demand the army be abolished, but they arm themselves. They urge us to discard the tricolor flag, while in its stead they hoist the red flag of hatred. Do not lend any credence to their manifestos and urgings, just as you did not believe that of the enemy when you were fighting at Oitz, Moristi, and Maracetti. The duty of every good Romanian is to see to it that in the future, too, the seed of dissension the enemy endeavors to throw among us does not take root. Perfect the work you began by your labor and your honor. Your enemies are the indolence, hatred, and dishonor that rule across the borders, that threaten us as well. Beware, keep clean your soul. Do not forget that our salvation is work, unity, and honor. Brothers, soldiers, with faith in God, you have broken the enemy's power. With your weapons, you have carved for eternity the country's borders. With your blood, you have perfected and sealed your sacrifice. That is why you must not allow foreign and lawless bands to destroy that which you perfected. Continue to hold your love of country and faith in your king. You took an oath to defend, with your blood to the last drop, the fatherland's borders. Guard them attentively against the evil intentions of the enemy, for that is what our parents and ancestors did. Brother peasants, The God of our parents took mercy on our suffering and gave us a bountiful year as was rarely seen. Be grateful to the good Lord through your labor and your faith. Renew your working powers. Gather assiduously the yield of the land. Rest assured that the land from the Tiza, the Danube, and the Black Sea was entirely won by you. Keep it in sacredness. Defend its riches to your labor and your love. Brother Romas, it is in you that the hopes and strength of this country lie. You are also the happiness of tomorrow. Do not gather for yourselves curses, but blessings. The enemy is attacking at the Dniester and at the Tisa. He also tries to disrupt the inner peace of our country. Our deliverance is in labor, honor, love of country, and faith in God. Be careful. Call on to the righteous path, also those who, straying, have crossed over to those without a people and without a faith. United around the throne and under the shadow of the tricolor banner, stand watch for the peace of the country. Tell the foreigners and foreign lovers who try to disturb us that around us a national guard has formed that watches, that will fight those wishing to sow among us discord. Romanians everywhere, workers, craftsmen, soldiers, and peasants, be worthy of our ancestors and of the call of these times in which we live. The Romanian Circle of Tradesmen, the Railway Traction Union, the Society of War Invalids, the Ironworkers Guild, etc. This is from the Conscious, August 30th of 1919. Let's see here. So here we're at the next part of the chapter, the leaders of the Romanian workers. The leaders of the Romanian communist workers were neither Romanians nor workers. At Iasi, Dr. Gellerter, Jew, Geller, Jew, Spiegler, Jew, Schreiber, Jew, etc. At Bucharest, Ili Moscovici, Jew, Pauker, Jew, etc. Around them, groups of lost Romanian workers. Had the revolution been successful, the President of the Republic that would have usurped the great King Ferdinand would have been Ili Moscovici. In Greater Romania's parliament in 1919, while the deputies and senators of all reunited Romanian provinces, thrilled by the great act of the Union, stood up and applauded the unifier great king, this Mr. Ili Moscovici refused to stand up, ostentatiously sitting down. And then we have the next part of the chapter here, the attitude of the Jewish press. It is necessary to underscore the attitude of the Jewish press in those perilous times for the Romanian people. Every time the Romanian nation was menaced in its existence, this press supported the thesis that best suited our enemies. As in fact, following the events, it can easily be seen that the same theses were doggedly opposed at any time they were favoring a movement of Romanian revival. For them, our worries were days of joy, while our joys for them were days of mourning. Freedom, so much today denied to the national movement, was back then considered dogma, because it was to serve the cause of our destruction. Here is, for instance, what Adverul of December, which means the truth, of December 28, 1919, wrote under the signature of Emile de Fagur, real name Honigman. So it says here, quote, by according to the Socialist Party, the right to freely demonstrate, one cannot maintain that said party is granted a privilege. No matter what the party that wants to demonstrate is, this right will have to be rejected. Unquote. Hatred. We can read in the same paper, quote, hatred must forever be the guide against a party of murderers that ruled, headed by Ion Brătianu, unquote. The Judaic hatred of the Romanians is blessed, is supported. One invokes it. It is not a crime. It is not a medieval shame. But when it comes time for the Romanians to defend their infringed rights, their action is labeled hatred, and hatred becomes a sign of barbarism, a debasing sentiment on which nothing can be built. legal order. At a Varul, October 5th, 1919, it is finished. By the high decree law, for the duration of the electoral period, a new regime is instituted, much tougher than before, one of siege and censorship, the opposition, and the whole country being taken outside of the law. It is pure and simple, the regime of military dictatorship in which the Crown alone is all-powerful. The Crown and the Liberal Party, and as an executor of these two wills, you have the government of generals. Thus the decree law forbids us to attack the Crown. If telling the truth can be taken as an attack, that the Crown took onto itself the heavy burden of governing the country with the Liberal Party, then still this attack we must make. The decree forbids us from attacking the present form of administration. If by this is understood that we have no right to protest with all vehemence against the present government, which is the result of the unconstitutional will of two persons, we will protest. If there is no other way open against the state of affairs, if we knew that the incitation to revolt or against the so-called legal order would have any effect, this unfortunately is not the case. We would not hesitate a single moment to do it, for there is no other means of fighting against such a dictatorial and tyrannical regime. We must consider ourselves facing an armed band which places itself outside the law and uses brutal force. Despite all this, we will raise this banner, and falling we will cry, quote, "Down with tyranny, long live freedom." This then is the Jewish press of 1919. In other words, inciting to rebellion against the Crown, against a form of government and the legal order. Then incitation to revolt from the Truth, October 11th, 1919, it says here, quote, "The madmen, where are the madmen?" Unquote. As we said, we have too many well-behaved men and no madmen. Or madmen is what we need. Those of 1848 were madmen, and they uprooted the boyars regime of the time. We too need madmen, with well-behaved men who split a hair into 14, it says STW, no idea what that was supposed to mean, not arriving at a decision. There is nothing to be done. We need at least one madman, if not more of them. What is this madman going to do? How do I know? One madman is then asked for. Let then the madmen come. Even the socialists have become well behaved. In reality, they have a party behind them and men who should fear no one. I see they are not afraid, but they are nevertheless well behaved, as I. Now the Žid did of old. They stubbornly stay away from the legal framework. Those in power, civilians and military, wish to take them out, a useless endeavor. Their tactic is the legal state, even when they are shot at, as on December 13th of 1918. When they are beaten to a pulp, when Framu is lowered by his henchmen into the grave, the socialist protest granted with great dignity, but they do not step outside the law. In any case, we need madmen. Let the madmen who would begin the illegal action, or that against the law, against the state of affairs, come forward. So people probably would claim that Codreanu was Fed posting right here, almost 100 years ago. Alright, here we go. Actually, it was 100 years ago, but it says the Crown. To the Romanians, the Crown always constituted a dear patrimony. As the guarantor of our unity and resistance, facing any dangers, the Jews never hesitated to attack it, to insult and compromise it by any means. Here is, for example, how the Morning of, which is, I believe, a newspaper of November 16th, 1919, treats King Ferdinand. Because of an error. An animal has need of limited preoccupations, but its brain suffices to fulfill them. Rarely, extremely rarely, is the animal wrong. Likewise, his intelligence, no matter how small, prevents it from falling into gross error. It is not the same with the king. I want to speak of the king of creation. The king of creation is much more intelligent than a dog, a horse, an ass. This is certain, but whereas none of these animals would step off the edge of a precipice, would not throw themselves into the water to drown, or would not attempt an unsafe move, the king of creation daily commits unpardonable errors. Wisdom demanded that the king not permit himself to fall prisoner into the hands of a single man or party. With all due respect, I am duty-bound to tell His Majesty he erred. The situation which is so unclear is the work of His Majesty, for His Majesty, giving into some guilty and interested obsessions, has run away from the natural solutions that the internal situation demanded. If even today the Crown will not decide to enter into the natural ways which are divorced from future interests, nature will exact its rights with even greater determination. Let the King of Creation be advised. Then we have here the Christian Church Opinia, from the Opinion, August 10, 1919. The nationalists of Iasi begin to agitate. There are too few of them, and they are too scoundrelly. That is why their agitating, which in times past was revolting, is today ridiculous, pure and simple. The nationalists formed a guard of the, says, quote, guard of the national conscience, unquote. Manifestos were issued, meetings were held, chauvinistic students were also invited. The customary priests also came. At a time when everywhere, out of the most despotic laws, differences among nationalities are being abolished, in our country, nationalists want to accentuate these differences. This particularly at the moment when the peace conference wants to oppose by treaty the control of minorities. When everywhere the church is being separated from the state, remaining the private concern of every individual in our country, the nationalists appeal to the clergy for organized religious propaganda of principle. Then the priest intervenes. He gently grasps the people by the hair of their heads and beats their foreheads against the stones of the church until they are dazed. It is in the church that the people learn humility and resignation. Such is the will of God. No one is fooled by lies any longer. It is in vain that the nationalists pin tricolor bands on their sleeves, that they incite plebeian intellectuals against the Jews, that they have the priests anthemize us in church. No one today fears their anthema. We preach love among people, and kick at the door of the temples which shelter hatred and revenge. Signed, M. Sevastos. Then we have the procession, from the Opinion, October 26, 1919. To the appeal of the, quote, guard of the national conscience, unquote, the honorable clergy placed at the disposal of the demonstrators their beards, vestments, and it's spelled out incorrectly, but it says church banners. But the luxury of having at one's disposal a god with a whole staff must be paid for. We prefer that from our taxes a professor be hired, not a priest. We wish, therefore, the separation of church from the state. For we do not wish that our forced contributions serve to encourage obscurantism, reunification, and the spirit of resignation, thanks to which police regimes are maintained back to the Middle Ages. We are exasperated by the terror in striped pants and tails and military tunic. Nor can we any longer tolerate the terror wearing the religious habit. It hurts us to see the street demonstrations prompted by political intrigues in the military, and no longer wish to witness parades of mitris and redneck kerchiefs. Enough! The cupolas of the church weigh heavily upon the shoulders of humanity. The prostrations pull it to the ground. This procession is going to be an insipid one. One will see on the streets museum vestments, brilliant-studded scepters, mitres, crosses will be seen, and stoles. Beards will pass. Orators with concordant gestures will bare their chests, showing the crowd their bloody side sucking between teeth sponges soaked in vinegar. Signed, M. Savastos. It is clear, from here to attacking officers and tearing off their stripes is but one step. Also one step to knocking down the churches with picks, or to their transformation in the stables or places of sadistic parties for the little Jewish reporters from The Opinion, The Truth, The Morning, and their people. I saw in the columns of these newspapers, at a time of great Romanian hardship, all the hatred and foxy plotting of an enemy race, settled and tolerated here by the pity, and only by the pity of the Romanians. I saw how they flaunted their lack of respect for the Romanian army's glory, and for the hundreds of thousands who died in its sanctified uniform, their lack of respect for the Christian faith for an entire people. No day passed without venom being poured into our hearts from each page. By reading those newspapers which crisped my soul, I came to know the real feelings of these aliens, which they revealed without reticence. At a time, they thought we had been knocked to the ground. I learned enough anti-Semitism in 1 year to last me 3 lifetimes. For one cannot strike the sacred beliefs of a people or what their heart loves and respects without hurting them to the depths and without blood dripping from their wound. 17 years have passed since, and the wound is still bleeding. May I be permitted once again to fulfill a sacred duty, mentioning here this hero, an athlete of Christian workingmen, the craftsman, Constantine Pancu, under whose command I stood, and by whose side I would stay until the quote-unquote red beast, as he called it, was defeated. It is to this man, to his courage and steadfastness, that is owed the deliverance of the city of Iasi from destruction. 7 years later, this giant, weakened by suffering and poverty, was walking the streets of Iasi like a shadow, seeking aid toward the treatment of a heart ailment. He died ill and poor, forgotten, unaided, in the midst of a country that cared not, and in a city which defended with his own body, and in a city which he defended with his own body in its most trying hours. That's the end of that part of the chapter. But Constantine Pancu, I want you to know that you are not forgotten, brother. One day when Romania is free of Zog, there will be a statue for you, I would hope. So now we're at the next part here of the first chapter, the first student congress after the war. This congress was held in the National Theatre in Cluj in an atmosphere of great enthusiasm as a result of the unification of the 26 Romanian people by force of arms and their sacrifice. This was the first meeting of the young intellectuals of a people who had been up to then scattered to the four winds by destiny and misfortune. 2,000 years of injustices and suffering were coming to an end. What enthusiasm! How many sacred emotions! How many tears did we all shed! But as great as our enthusiasm was for the present which overwhelmed our hearts through its majesty, just as great was our disorientation with respect to what line to follow in the future. It was from this uncertainty that the Judaic power sought to profit, by suggesting to and ultimately exerting pressure on the ministries, Masonry, and politicians to place on the agenda of the Congress the possible admittance of Jewish students into the students' associations. In other words, the transformation of the Romanian associations into mixed Romanian Jewish ones was attempted. The danger was serious. On one hand, Bolshevism was knocking at the door. On the other, the probability of being overwhelmed numerically by Judeo-communist elements in our own groups, in at least two of them, Iasi and Cernati. The situation was tragic. In spite of this, the leaders of the Congress, Labuska, the president of the Iasi Student Association, and his entire committee, Nazarari, Bucharest's president with his whole committee and all associations, and Pușcaru, Cluj's president, were won over to this idea. Young students are influenced very easily, particularly when they lack of faith. They let themselves be lured not so much by the immediate material advantages they might be offered, but more particularly by flattery, and by the prospect of a great future they were promised. But the youth must know that no matter what position he will hold, he is a sentinel in the service of the nation, and that permitting himself to be bought, flattered, lured, means a dereliction of duty, and could even lead to destruction or betrayal. A small, unofficial group of us from Aisi, unshakable in our determination, united with that of the Bukovinans, fought fiercely for 2 days, and ultimately we won. The Congress passed a motion I proposed by vote, as opposed to the motion by the entire student leadership. I believe the Congress voted thus not so much out of conviction, as out of admiration for the determination and desperation with which our fight was conducted. The students from Cernuti, no more than 60, behaved admirably. Our small group of Aisans, not more than 20, likewise. If we add to the Chio-China group of 20, also from Aisi, the 2-day battle was won by 100 versus 5,000. That victory of ours then was decisive. Had our point of view lost, the student associations would have also lost their Romanian character, and in contrast with the Jews, would have turned towards Bolshevism. The Romanian student body was at a great crossroad, and later in 1922, we would not have had the eruption of a Romanian students' movement, but perhaps the eruption of the communist revolution. So now we are at the next part of the chapter, the opening of the Iasi University in the fall of 1920. In the other university centers, there was quiet. Only ours at Iasi was condemned to continuous struggle. For the first time in the history of Iasi University, the University Senate announced the opening of the academic year without the customary religious service. In order for someone to understand our sorrow, one must know that this solemn ceremony has been, without interruption, for half a century, the university's most beautiful event. This occasion embraced the entire University Senate, all professors, all students newly registered, and the intellectual elite of Iasi. The service was always celebrated the auditorium by Moldavia's metropolitan or his vicar, blessing the start of a new year in the education of the Romanian people. But now our university was casting aside, by a gesture of the University Senate, this jewel of its half-century tradition. Graver yet, the University of our Christian Iasi, the highest institution of Romanian learning, was as proclaiming in those difficult times the fight against God, the banishment of God in schools, institutions, and country. The professors of Iasi University accepting 4 or 5 known to oppose this trend, welcomed with great satisfaction the heathen decision of the Senate as a step forward that would take, quote, Romanian science out of barbarism and medieval preconceptions. Communist students were jubilant, Jewry triumphant, while a few of us pondered sorrowfully. We wondered how long it would be before churches were torn down, and priests in their vestments were crucified on their altars. About 8 of us national students in Iasi at the time knocked in vain at the doors of many of the professors, trying to convince them to rescind the measure taken by the Senate, but our repeated attempts failed. And then on the evening before the start of the academic year, we decided to take a grave step. We would forcibly oppose the opening of the university. In order to stay grouped, we all slept at number 4 Sohupan Street, the headquarters of our nation. At 6 in the morning, Vladimir Freenu and myself left for the university. The others were to follow. We closed and barricaded the rear door of the university, leaving Fremu there to guard it. I put up a poster in red pencil on the large entrance door reading, quote, I bring to the attention of the students as well as to that of the professors that this university is going to open only following the traditional religious service, unquote. The rest of our comrades came late, too late. Students started coming at 8 o'clock. Alone at the entrance, I resisted until about 9:30, by which time over 300 students had gathered. When mathematics professor, Professor Muller, wanted to force his way in, I told him, quote, "You swore on the cross when you became a professor at this university. Why do you now raise yourself against the cross? You are a perjurer, because you had sworn on something you did not believe in, and now you break that oath," unquote. Then the students, headed by Marin, the communist leader, Harichu and Ayoshku from Botosani, dashed at me, opened the university's main entrance, took me into the lobby, hitting me over the head with sticks and fists. No defense, no riposte was possible, for I was caught in the middle, pushed from all directions, getting blows from everywhere. Finally, I was left alone. As I stood in the corner reflecting upon the misfortune of my defeat, in came 6 students. However, the victory of the enemy did not last very long, for shortly the university secretary came down from the rectorate and posted the following notice, quote, "It is brought to everybody's attention that the rectorate has decided that this university will remain closed until Wednesday, when it will open with a religious service," unquote. This was a great victory that we welcomed with unsurpassed joy. Wednesday morning, 2 days later, in the auditorium, filled to capacity by city people, was conducted the religious service. I was congratulated by everybody. Professor A.C. Kuza spoke with an unsurpassed eloquence. It was at that moment that the belief took hold in me, and it has never left me, that one who fights for God and his people, even if alone, will never be defeated. In the public opinion at Iyasi, these battles, especially those at ASM and the railway works, and lastly that at the university, have had a powerful echo. The enemy began to realize that Bolshevism cannot advance without serious obstacles, even when it is supported by nearly all of the university's professors, the entire press, all Jewry, the largest proportion of working men, while on the other side there is only a minimal group of youth opposing these huge waves, armed only with their great faith in the future of their country. These youth presented the barrier of their wills comparable to some jagged rocks in the ground, over which one can easily see but cannot climb over without great hurt. In fact, one would not even ever think of doing so. The enemies feared not so much us, but our determination. The sane part of the population, the Christian Romanian Iyasi, encouraged us and sympathetically watched us. So now we're at the next portion of the chapter, the 1920 to 1921 university year. Begun in the conditions mentioned earlier, this year was an unending series of battles and clashes. We, the fighting students, organized ourselves around the student Stefan Voda association, whose president I was. From here we attacked our adversaries, vanquishing them time and again. Despising Romanian culture, they looked down upon the university and everything we had in this country with pretensions of being savants and advisors, like some men arriving from a great country upon this sinful and backward Romanian soil. They may have been right in certain points, but soon they would clash in our little country with a great centuries-old common sense that they and their large empire, there beyond the Dniester, proved never to have had at all. At the university, meetings became impossible. No decision could any longer be taken. The great majority of students was made up of communists and their sympathizers, but they could not take one step forward because our group, never over 40, was always present. We attacked and did not permit the airing of communist ideas and practices. The general strike tried at the Iyasi University when the communist student Spiegler was arrested failed after 1 day because our group occupied the mess hall, forbidding strikers entrance to meals on the grounds that, quote, "whoever does not work does not eat," unquote. All pleadings of the rector and the professors to convince us that these students ought to be permitted to enter for their meals were made in vain. Shortly thereafter, our group was to win another victory, the change of the uniform. Communist students were wearing Russian caps. Not that they had no other caps, but as in ostentatious sign of affirming Bolshevism. On the occasion of a clash at the university, these caps were grabbed and burnt in Union Square. Then daily, at the university on the streets, through pubs, the hunting started. All caps were burnt. After 1 week, they completely disappeared. Our group went even further and engaged the Judeo-Communist press in battle. We did not have any printing presses to spread our word. Following several disrespectful articles about the king, the army, and the church, our group, running out of patience, invaded the offices and printing presses of the newspapers Lumia, published by the Jew Hefter and Opinia. So they're invading the world, like the newspapers called The World and The Opinion, and then it says here, and wrecked the presses that had spewed poison and insult. We provoked disorders, no doubt. Those disorders would stop the great disorder, the irreparable disorder that the hireling communist revolution were preparing for our country. But all this activity made me the principal object of their revenge. The Jewish press attacked us. I violently responded. Meeting the editors of The Opinion one day on the street following a verbal exchange, after I demanded they account for their insults, we had a fight. My adversaries were soundly beat up. The next day, all newspapers in Iasi made common front against me. The Opinion, the World, and the Movement. It says here, expelled from Iasi University forever. Things did not stop here. The University Senate took action immediately. It met and, without giving me a hearing, expelled me forever from Iasi University. Finally, both the university and the city of Iasi would get rid of the disturber of the public order, who for 2 years disrupted the peace of Judeo-Communists and opposed all their endeavors to unleash the revolution for the enthronement of our king, the burning down of churches and the shooting of the officers, and the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Romanians. The men of order and legality were, in the eyes of the University Senate, the communists, the disruptor of this order, and the Council of the School of Law. But their plans fell flat because a truly unique event intervened in the ordinary course of our student life. The Council of the Law faculty took issue with the expulsion pronounced by the Senate, led by Professor Cuza, its dean, along with Professors Matei Cantacuzino and Dmitri Alexandrescu opposed this move. The endeavors of the Council to moderate the fury of the University Senate failed. The Senate did not rescind the expulsion order. Then, the Faculty of Law withdrew its representative from the Senate, no longer opposed this decision, and declared itself independent. I was informed by the law faculty that I could continue to attend classes, for the professional council refused to recognize the decision of the University Senate. Thus, I continued to remain on as a student at Iasi University. As a result of this incident, the Council of the Faculty of Law did not send its representative to the University Senate for 3 years. This conflict continued for years longer, even after I left the university. Later on, when I obtained my degree, the rectorate refused to issue my diploma, and to this day they have not issued it. To register in the bar and to continue my studies abroad, I made use of the certificate issued to me by the Faculty of Law. Interesting. So, they refused to give him his degree, but he could still go to classes, and he was certified, so I guess that works. Next part of the chapter, the university year 1921 and 1922. The new academic year opened under normal conditions, that is, with religious service. Again, the university and the city of Iasi were in a festive mood. This great event passed almost unnoticed in Bucharest. There, when students arrive, their number is lost in the multitude of hundreds of thousands of people, the noise, the lights, and the many conflicting interests. In Iasi, when students leave, a general melancholy descends as when the crane and the birds leave in the fall. When students return, the youth comes, the life. It is a holiday. In Bucharest, the student feels alone in the middle of an immense world that sees him not, does not appreciate him or admonish or have any interest in him, does not love him. The student's education at EASI bears no similarity to that at Bucharest, for he develops like a child under the love of his mother and the shelter of the Romanian's love. Here the nation raises her students. I myself owe this EASI an important share of gratitude for anything I was able to do. I've always felt the concern that this spirit of EASI held for me. I felt the ray of its love. I felt its admonition, encouragement, urging, its call to fight. These are following us, the students of EASI, even now, and they will follow us to the end of our lives as the ever-present memory of my mother's urgings and love. Out of all the student generations who passed through EASI, how many were not stimulated all their lives by EASI's call to fight? How many were not accompanied all the way to their graves? How many are even today haunted by its reproaches? It was noticeable at the beginning of the year that Judeo-Communism backed down, disoriented, its morale practically nil, and put up no resistance. All the newly enrolled students had heard of our battles and had for a long time been waiting to come to our side. Once here, they joined our ranks. President of the Law Students Association. I was elected that fall president of the Association of Law Students. The University Senate refused my validation on the pretext that I had been expelled from the university. I validated myself. Our Law Students Association, like the associations in all the other colleges, had as its purpose the scientific activity of completing and deepening studies in their respective fields. For instance, under the presidency of Nelu Ionescu, 2 years ahead of me, the Association of Law Students held meetings almost every week. Some students read a book on law or a related field, condensed it, and in a meeting presented a critique. Contradictory discussions then took place. I retained this general format, but I also added something new. All these themes and reports could not be treated unless they developed scientifically into the Jewish problem. Works treating this problem in Romania and abroad were read on the international Jewish power, on the history of this problem at home and abroad. We were studying not only their methods of fighting us, but the Judaic spirit and mentality as well, and then we proposed various means of fighting back and defending ourselves. Then after each exposition, there followed discussions, completions, and lastly, the formulations of the established truths so that everybody could leave enlightened. Furthermore, in the same meetings we sought to accomplish A, the identification in every step of this Judaic spirit and mentality that have stealthily infiltrated the thinking and feeling pattern of a large portion of Romanians. B, our detoxification, namely the elimination of Judaism that was introduced in our thinking through books at schools, literature, professors, through lectures, theater, and cinematography. C, the understandings and unmasking of the Jewish plans hidden under so many forms, for we have political parties led by Romanians through which Judaism speaks. Romanian newspapers that are written by Romanians, through which the Jew speaks for his interests. Romanian lecturers and authors, thinking, writing, and speaking Jewish in the Romanian language. Studying all these, we began to realize for the first time in history, the Romanian had come into contact with a people which uses weapons to fight and destroy, as national weapons, slyness and perfidy. The Romanian has always known only the honest fight. Faced with the new Jewish method, he was at a loss. We realized that everything comes down to knowing the enemy, and that as soon as we Romanians know him, we will vanquish him. Our meetings continued for the whole year. They attracted larger and larger numbers of students from their colleges, so that the General Association of EASI students became almost non-existent. The general student body gravitated around the activity of the law group. The auditorium became too small for the crowds of students who wished to take part in these meetings. The Bessarabian students were participating in greater and greater numbers. 1/2 year of activity brought us a real miracle. 3/4 of the Christian Bessarabian students woke up, felt themselves called to a new life, became enlightened. In a short time, they were to become the most faithful soldiers in our fight, reaching through faith, devotion, purity of heart and spirit of sacrifice, the leadership of the movement that had just begun to bud. This moment of brotherhood and the same faith and of pledging to fight for our Christian country against the cheating Judaic hordes will never be forgotten. We who were fighting each other, but yesterday were now embracing. The orientation guidelines in our meetings were the writings of our national geniuses, Bogdan Petriciu Hajdu, Vasil Contra, Mihail Emishku, Vasil Alexandri, etc., but especially the writings and lectures of Professor Cuza, the writings of Professor Polescu, the lessons in national education of Professor Gavanshko. All the writings of Professor Cuza were read not only once, but 3, 4 times, and they were studied. Particularly, his course in political economy, treating brilliantly the Jewish question from his prestigious position, asking Romanians to understand this, their gravest present problem, was for us a guide for every moment in our effort to get to know it. Our greatest good fortune, and that of Romanians, was thus having Professor Cuza, one of the most knowledgeable men on the worldwide Jewish problem. It was thanks to him that we were able to orient ourselves to any Jewish maneuver. His courses of the highest academic standard were followed by all students who had hitherto unprecedented attention. The auditorium of the School of Law proved always too small. For a long time to come, this University of Iasi will not have a professor with sermons on nationalism that will inspire a similar enthusiasm. During this time, for many of us, life began to reveal a unique purpose over all other interests, that of fighting for our people whose existence was very threatened. So, it's the end of this part of this chapter, but I think it's quite telling that even 100 years ago, and no offense to Romanians, kind of more obscure Eastern European country, that it was still super hard to find one professor who could just name the Jew and speak about the Jewish menace honestly in facets of life such as the economy. They have had a stranglehold on Western institutions for a very, very long time. Alright, next part of the chapter here. Visiting the Cernaudi University. At the other universities, quiet prevailed. Since the spring of the previous year, 1921, in Cernaudi, there had begun stirrings around the Romanianization of the theater. A fierce battle of several days ended with the students' victory. Now, in the spring of 1922, I organized under the auspices of the Association of Law Students a visit of the Aisins to Samaudi. We were well received by both professors and students. We 100 visitors did nothing else the 3 days we stayed there, but impart to our colleagues in Cernaudi the new faith which was taking shape in our souls. It was not difficult, for Cernaudi, just like Iasi, only more so, suffered from the Jewish invasion, with its streets, its commerce, and its dilapidated churches, its land and Romanians, all groaning under Jewish domination. Briefly, between us and a new and tight spiritual kinship was created, based on a yearning and our common dream to see for once our people awaken to the consciousness of dignity, power, and rights as master of their own fate and that of their country. This kinship then grew stronger through the visit repaid us by the Samaudi students 1 month later. It was now that I met for the first time Tudos Popescu, that handsome figure of a young fighter resembling a Pandur, who was later one of the leaders of the student movement, but who today sleeps in a poor cemetery under a forgotten cross. The review, this is the next part of the chapter, the review Aparina Națională. On April 1st, 1922, the bi-monthly Aparia Națională, which translates to the National Defense, was published under the editorship of Professors Cuza and N.C. Polescu. Anyone can imagine what the publication of this magazine meant for us in the midst of our thoughts and concerns. In it, we found everything that we needed for our own complete comprehension and usable arguments. The articles of Professor Cuza and Polescu were religiously read by all the youth and had everywhere upon students, both in Bucharest and in Cluj, a resounding impact. We considered the publication of each issue a triumph, because it was, for us, another munitions transport for combating the arguments in the Jewish press. I deem it appropriate to reproduce here 2 articles published at the time under the signatures of Professor Cuza and Polescu. Quote, "The divine spirit of," and it's spelled TMTB, not sure what he meant by that, "will forever defend mankind. In resume, the Talmud, the political co-religious legislation of the Hebrews, in lieu of combating like the gospel the passions of ownership and domination. On the contraire, cuspids these vices to an unbeard of peak, in order to accomplish Judah's dream of being at the same time both the owner of the earth and the master of all mankind. But while the Christian apostles preach their ideal in the open, the Talmud hides, and its 2 appendages, the Kahal and Freemasonry, are even more invisible. The 3 of them use, in order to remain in the dark, a scabrous and accursed means, namely the lie. In other words, the lie is the basis of the system used by the Jews, to whom one can say, "You speak, therefore you be." But the lie has a mortal enemy, namely the truth, for truth is the distinctive trait of Christianity. Christ said, "I am the truth," and that is why his doctrine is an execration by Israel. The lie, on the contrary, characterizes what is called the spirit of evil or of the devil. Thus Jesus, speaking of the Hebrews, said to them, "You are of your father, the devil, and the lusts of your father it is your will to do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and standeth not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for B is a lie." I think it says it's spelled B-E, but I think it's supposed to say, "He speaketh of his own, for he is a liar, and the father thereof." Leaving this world, Christ sent his disciples an invisible weapon, namely his ghost, the divine spirit of truth, which will defend mankind forever against the devilish spirit of the lie. I bow before the spirit of truth, saying from the bottom of my soul, "I believe in the Holy Ghost." Unquote. From Professor Dr. N.C. Polescu, from Philosophic Physiology, the Talmud, the Kahal, Freemasonry, Volume 2, Bucharest, 1913. Wish I could learn a class like learn about this in university course. I don't think university courses offer classes like this. So it says here, the science of anti-Semitism. Quote, "Another horrible pairing of words, the science of anti-Semitism. How can anti-Semitism be a science? Will ask themselves indignantly the scientists with their rocks, those with their seals, the mathematicians with their X's, the philologists with their suffixes, the scientists with their pretended fixed ideas of nature. Anti-Semitism. For these scientists, it is only a savagery, a blind manifestation of brutal instincts, vestiges of prehistoric times, the shame of our civilization, which both science and the enlightened conscience of man, free of preconceptions and passion, condemn. This is the atmosphere created particularly by the Jews, and which those Judaized nurture around anti-Semitism, fooling the naive or exploiting the naivete of the stupid with pretensions that they, too, be on a par with modern civilization. And who does not want to be? For example, there is this interesting case of a Judaized individual, himself half Jewish, speaking several years earlier with the air of a terrific scientist about our anti-Semitism, which was then, as it is today, unchanged. And here's what this author, Nomen Odiosum, tells us in Viata Romanesca, which means the Romanian life. Second year, November 1907. Let's see here. A traitor, then, of national thought, as he was later a traitor of our national action during the war. It says, quote, I want to talk about the Jewish question, totally denatured by the vulgar and ferocious Judeo-phagy of our anti-Semites, who thus compromise us before the civilized world. With rusted weapons dug out from the arsenal of medieval persecutions, with hatred propaganda, with impassioned incitement to excesses, with the stirring of bestial instincts in popular masses. One can only compromise a just cause, but the cause of anti-Semitism is not a just one. But to give this conflict a false air of persecuting a race, a religious persecution, in a word of anti-Semitism can serve only the enemy's cause, only too glad to exploit the divagations of some maniacs. Anti-Semitic scandalmongers prematurely place on the order of the day the entire question. No people, let alone our own, can fence itself in ad infinitum, free of repercussions, against modem ideas, probably meant to say modern, nor against external political action. That is, they are not suspensive, but threatening, seemingly containing a fantastic political provision. Therefore, to place our question in the realm of anti-Semitism, our racial hatred means for us being led to a shameful and fatal defeat. Asiatic urgings, violent demagoguery, unhealthy agitation, an endeavor of speculating dark passions. And it says, the last dots again are those of the authors talking about the same threat for such horrible crimes like those of anti-Semitism. So that's unquote for this quote that they're quoting with this Jew here. But we're still quoting this one professor. It says, I quoted this typical concept, typical of all who sold themselves to the Jews, and one sees what it comes down to. Clichés, such as the civilized world, modern ideas, but particularly the slander, such as talking about vulgar and ferocious Judeo-phagy, rusty weapons, bestial instincts, divagations of some maniacs, anti-Semitic scandalmongers, Asiatic urgings, dark passions. We find such appreciations not only coming from the vulgar Jew lovers, but sometimes even from some otherwise distinguished representatives of culture in other fields. Thus, for instance, the eminent jurist, university professor, orator, man of politics, former minister of public instruction, Mr. A.C. Arion, leveled at me because of my anti-Semitism. In the full session of the Chambers of Deputies, the apostrophe, we can say, famous coming from such a man calling me the caveman. As for the Jews, their explanation of anti-Semitism is more characteristic yet. In addition to the usual cliché, with hatred and savagery, naturally with no motive, they do not care to discuss motives. According to them, anti-Semitism is a madness, an intellectual degeneration, an affliction of the spirit. This is how we are considered by one of the most distinguished modern intellectuals of the Jews, Dr. K. Lipp, an illustrious origin as great-grandson of the famous commentator of the Talmud in the Middle Ages, Rasi, who said, Tov sebi goyim barog, which translates to, kill the best of the goyim. Dr. K. Lipp, M.D., came our way from Galicia and settled down in Ayasi, where he served time for having killed a woman while performing an abortion on her. Even authored a special work in German entitled Symptoms of the Mental Illness Anti-Semitism, written in 1887. And as proof that the arguments used by the parasitic Jews against anti-Semitism are very poor, just as are those of the Judaized and always the same, here is what Curiol Israelite which is the Israelite Courier, official organ of the Union of Naturalized Jews, says in the editorial of its issue of this Friday, September 15th, 1922, under the title to us who write at the Apparare Nationale, which means the National Defense, slanderous. A band of rascals. There exists with these anti-Semites a state of intellectual degeneration, and this is what we're quoting here, I believe, from the Israelite Courier. There exists with these anti-Semites a state of intellectual degeneration that reached a perversity of the senses, some kind of mental sadism by which those touched are pushed to lies and calumnies. As you can see, this is a very simple explanation as well as an extremely naive one. All that is said against the Jews is lies and calumnies due to a specific intellectual degeneration. The definition of anti-Semitism, according to Jews and those Judaized, is then summed up in two words: savagery and madness, naturally of the anti-Semites. As for the Jews as a social phenomena, they do not even enter into this explanation, as if they did not exist. It was this... Okay. So this is written very badly, but it looks like the professor is now writing this. He's not quoting the Jew anymore. As if they did not exist. It was like this savagery and madness that compelled all peoples of all time. Egyptians, Persians, Romans, Arabs, as well as the modern nations up to this day, to consider Jews as a national menace and take measures against them. It was this savagery and madness which darkened the understanding of the most prominent representatives of the culture of all nations, such as Cicero, Seneca, Tacitus, Mohammed, Martin Luther, Giordano Bruno, Frederick the Great, Voltaire, Joseph II, Napoleon, Goethe, Herder, Immanuel Kant, Fichte, Schopenhauer, Charles Fournier, Ludwig Feuerbach, Richard Wagner, Bismarck, Rudolf Virchow, Theodor Billroth, Eugen Liefering, and countless others in fields to come out against the Jews. Savagery and madness finally explains the anti-Semitism of the most distinguished representatives of our culture, such as Simeon Barnutiu, B.P. Hajdow, Vasil Alexandri, Vasil Contra, Mihail Emiscu. Savage and mad, all these. Civilized and well-behaved. Those Judaized, and the Jews non-existent. And venality of those Judaized is incapable of explaining anti-Semitism as a social phenomena. We will call it the anti-Semitic theory. According to this theory of ours, in the makeup of anti-Semitism, we must distinguish three stages: instinct, consciousness, science. Instinct always made the crowd, firstly preoccupied by its immediate material interests, oppose Jewish parasitism through popular movements, oftentimes general and bloody, as it was among many others all over. Example, the terrible movement of the Cossacks in the Ukraine, led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, in which over 250,000 Jews perished in 1649. Consciousness of the Jewish menace is awakened gradually, first in the educated classes, then it spreads and penetrates the masses. The former group unites with the people in supporting their demands. The latter thus become progressively aware themselves. Science begins with partial researches until it reaches, only in our day, the determination of its objective. Studying Judaism as a social phenomenon, lifted out from the medium in which it seeks to hide, concluding that it is a human problem, in fact the biggest, whose solution must be found. We could say, by virtue of the conclusions reached by partial studies so far, that they form the anti-Semitism of science. This is the basis, which is not to be confused with the science of anti-Semitism. What distinguishes them is their different objectives. And here is the definition as determined by its objective of this science, which clearly demonstrates it to be a true science with its own domain. The science of anti-Semitism has as its object Judaism as a social problem, being thus necessarily the synthesis of all sciences that can contribute to its solution. Which sciences these are, that through their partial studies contribute to the knowledge of Judaism, we already have seen, and this is the way in which the science of anti-Semitism uses their findings in order to arrive at a solution. History establishes that from the earliest times, the Jews have been a people wandering among others, nomadic, countryless. The science of anti-Semitism establishes that this nomadism is contrary to the well-being of agricultural, sedentary peoples and cannot be tolerated. Anthropology establishes that Jews are a mixture of unrelated races, differing among themselves as the Semitic, Aryan, Negro, Mongolian. The science of anti-Semitism explains the sterility of the Jewish nation in the domain of culture as a result of this mongrelization, and shows that this mongrel cannot contribute anything to the culture of other nations, which they only falsify, denaturing their characteristics. Theology establishes that the Jewish religion is an exclusivist religion, based on the special covenant made between their God, Yahweh, and the Jews considered as a chosen, sacred people, apart from other people. The science of anti-Semitism rigorously deduces that such a concept excludes the possibility of any peaceful cooperation or any assimilation from the Jews. Politics establishes that everywhere within other nations, Jews have their unique social organization, constituting a state within the state. The science of anti-Semitism concludes that Jews are an archaic element, dangerous to the existence of all states. Political economy establishes that Jews have lived in all times, even in Palestine, as a superimposed people over other nations, exploiting their labor, themselves not being direct producers. The science of anti-Semitism says that any people has the right to defend its productive labor from exploitation from Jews, who cannot be tolerated living like parasites, jeopardizing people's existence. Philosophy states that Judaism's concept of life is an anachronism contrary to human advancement. The science of anti-Semitism imposes as a duty towards civilian that this cultural monstrosity be eliminated by the united efforts of all nations. Let's see here. The science of anti-Semitism bases its conclusions on what various but differing special sciences objectively established, all of which lead necessarily to the same conclusion. The elimination of Jews from the midst of other people, putting an end to their unnatural parasitic existence that is due to an anachronistic concept opposed to the civilization and peace of all nations who can no longer tolerate it. This anti-Semitic theory differs, as one can see, from the Jewish theory and that of the Judaized, which reduced anti-Semitism to the two individual expressions, that in fact, the minute they are manifested in mass, become themselves a social problem, savagery and hatred, and explains this as well. The blind instinct of anti-Semitism can sometimes be accompanied by savagery and hatred. For instinct is blind, so they say, though it is essential in advancing life. The consciousness of anti-Semitism is added, however, to the instinct enforcing its urges, no matter how savage. For in order to be civilized, one must first exist. The science of anti-Semitism finally comes to explain this phenomena, enlightening further the consciousness of people, fully satisfying their instinct and its violent eruptions, thus legitimized by revealing their cause, the parasitism of Jews. Thus it gives us the formula of the scientific solution for the problem of Judaism, which in order to realize, we have only to apply modern anti-Semitism then, pulls all energies, the energy of instinct, conscious science, of fully revealed truth, forming a formidable social force, certainly capable of solving the greatest problem of civilization of our times, which is the Jewish problem. And what do the Jews and the Judaizers put up with against this great power? Seeking to prolong the condemned existence of their parasitism, we have seen they put up against us cliches, slanders, and whims. The vulgar Judeo-faggy of our anti-Semites, they compromise us in the eyes of the civilized world. Rusty weapons dug out of the arsenal of medieval persecutions, the stirring up of bestial instincts in the popular masses, Asiatic urges, madness, mental sadism. And that's quoting that Jew again from 1887. These are all the arguments they oppose to our anti-Semitism, for they have no others, thinking they can do away with it by their stupidities, while within all the nations revolted by the nomadic Judah's parasitism, revenging energy boils. And that's the end of, unquote, that's the end of A.C. Kuza's National Defense article regarding the science of anti-Semitism. So now we have the founding of the Association of Christian Students. It says here on May 20th, 1922, the limited meeting we abolished. In a limited meeting, we abolished the General Students Association of IASI, which had been still in the hands of a remnant of adversaries supported by the Rectorate, and we founded the Association of Christian Students, which even today is still alive. We were a small group when we started. Then we found a student circle evolving later into the Association of Law Students, and now, finally, from our labors, a real General Student Association was being born under the name of the Association of Christian Students, for which the hearts of all the IASI students were beating, but a different student body, unlike that of 1919. By now, not without considerable melancholy in my soul, following 3 years of battle and dear friendships annealed in the fire of so many trials, I was approaching the day of my departure from the university, from student life, and from my comrades in battle. I only had 1 month before taking my degree exam, and I could not resign myself to the idea of having to leave, that we, the 1919 high school graduates, so tightly bound in heart, would scatter. God only knows to which corners of the country. That is why, after we designated my successors, Sava Marginkaunu in the Association of Students in Law, and Ili Garnitia in the Association of Christian Students, 26 comrades who felt ourselves closer together took a vow aiming to fight no matter where we were, for the creed that bound us together while students at university. We all signed this vow, placed it in a bottle, then buried it in the ground. After I passed my degree exams, another vow was taken from a second group of 46, newer in battle. These were my guests in Husi, where for 4 days we held meetings, clarifying in our minds the minutest details regarding our future activity. Here my father spoke to my comrades on several occasions, urging them to fight. Then we parted ways, carrying in our soul the yearning for better and more just days for our people. Here we have the next part of the chapter, Obligation of Honor. The undersigned students at the University of IASI, realizing the difficult situation in which the Romanian people finds itself menaced in its very existence by an alien people that grabbed our land, intends to grab the leadership of the country, so that our descendants not wander through foreign lands, chased from their land by misery and poverty, and so that our people not bleed under the tyranny of an alien people. We determinedly rise around a new and sacred ideal, that of defending our fatherland against Jewish invasion. It is around this ideal that we form the Association of Christian Students at IASI University. It is with this ideal in our hearts that we leave the school halls today, to fight wherever we may be, for our justice, for the threatened life of our people. We consider it being our foremost honor-bound duty. That is why, congregated today, Saturday, May 27th of 1922, we pledge ourselves to a common obligation, that, scattering throughout the country, We take with us everywhere the fire which animated us in the times of our youth, to light in the saddened hearts of our people the torch of truth, that of their right to a free life in these lands. We shall maintain the closest contact with the association which we leave behind today and in which we remain supporting members. It is being the central point that we shall always unite. It being the central point that shall always unite us in our common struggle. We will meet again in 8 years, in 1930, May 1st through 14th at EAS University. The association's committee will see to it that all members shall be notified 2 months before today, and will prepare for their arrival. We invite all student generations following us through this association who shall show an understanding of consecrating their labor on the fatherland's altar to join us that year and that day at EAS University. And there's a list of all the people here. There's a lot of people, clearly. And then we're approaching the end here of our first chapter. So it says, at the end of my university studies. At home, the 3 years spent at the university passed before my eyes, and I was asking myself, how could we overcome so many obstacles? How could we defeat the mentality, the will of thousands of men? How could we vanquish university senates? How could we soften the daring of an entire enemy press? Did we have money to hire mercenaries, to publish papers, to go out into the countryside, to feed this real war? We had nothing. When I threw myself into that first battle, I did not do it because of someone else's urging, or as a result of some confab or some earlier decision which I was charged to execute, or even under the impulse of the great prolonged inner turmoil or deep thinking in which I had considered this problem. Nothing of the sort. I cannot describe how I entered this fight. Perhaps as a man who, walking on the street with his worries and thoughts, surprised by the fire which consumes a house, takes off his coat, jumping to the aid of those engulfed by flames. I, with the mind of a youth of 19-20 years of age, understood from all that I saw that we were losing our country, and that we were no longer going to have a country, that by the unconscious collaboration of the poor Romanian working men, impoverished and exploited, the ruling and devastating Jewish horde would engulf us. I acted on orders from my heart, from an instinct of defense possessed by even the least crawling worm, not out of an instinct for mere personal preservation, but one for defending the people of whom I was a part. That is why all the time I had the feeling that the whole people was behind us, with all the living, with all those who have died for their country, with its future generations, that our people fights and speaks through us, that the enemy numbers, no matter how large, faced with this historic entity, are but a handful of human wretches that we will scatter and vanquish. That is why all of our adversaries failed, beginning with the thoughtless university senates, who, believing they were fighting in us a handful of crazy youth, fought and struck in reality their own people. There exists a law of nature which puts everyone in his place, rebels against nature, from Lucifer to the present day. All these rebels, oftentimes very intelligent, though always lacking wisdom, have fallen thunderstruck. When in the framework of this natural law, of this wise order, anyone can fight, has the right to fight for betterment, probably meant to say betterment. Outside it, against it, over this order, no one can activate unpunished and unvanquished. In the human organism, blood globules must remain within its framework and in its service. A rebellion would exist not only if a globule should bestir itself against the organism, but when it would do even less, namely, when it would be its own employ, when it would only satisfy itself, when it would have no other purpose and ideal outside itself, when it would become its own God. The framework within the individual within the framework and in the service of his people, the people within the framework and in the service of their God and of God's laws. Whoever shall understand these things will be victorious even if he is alone. Whoever shall not understand will be defeated. I finished my 3rd university year under the imperium of these thoughts. From an organizational point of view, we had settled on the idea of leader and discipline. Democracy was excluded, not out of speculation or by conviction reached by way of theory. We had lived anti-democracy from the very start. I always led. In 3 years, it was only once that I was elected president of the Association of Law Students. At all other times, it was not the fighters electing me leader, but I choosing them to follow. I had never had committees and never put propositions to a vote. However, whenever I felt the need, I consulted with everyone. But on my own responsibility, I took decisions on my own. That is why our small group was always unshakable. Was always an unshakable unit. And I want to repeat this because it's important. I never had committees, and I never put propositions to a vote. However, whenever I felt the need, I consulted with everyone, but on my own responsibility, I took decisions on my own. That is why our small group was always an unshakable unit. This is how decision-making is supposed to be. Hierarchical, with people inputting their voices, but having a strong leader making the decision at the end. And continuing, factions of divided opinions, majorities or minorities, clashing among themselves on questions of action or theory, did not exist. With all the other groups, the opposite was true, which is why they fell defeated. One, and it says GRE, at faith, like a flame continuously burning in our hearts, lighting our way. A great and unforgettable love for one another, a great discipline, one decision during battle, and a balanced weighing of the plan of battle. These, our fatherland's blessing and God's, assured us the victory those 3 years. And then it says here, the summer of 1922. The summer of 1922 did not pass peacefully. On the stages of Romanian national theaters or communal ones in Moldovan towns, Jewish plays began to be performed in Yiddish by the Cornpop troupe. Our youth considered this a threat, for it saw a beginning of the alienation of this institution, meant to be for the national and moral education of the Romanian people. Expropriated in commerce, industry, and the enrichment of the Romanian soil and subsoil, in the press, we will see ourselves one day expropriated also from the stage of our national theaters. The theater, together with the school and the church, can elevate a decayed nation to the consciousness of its rights and historical mission. It can prepare and motivate a nation to liberating struggle. From now, even this redoubt shall be taken away from us. Our theaters that were built by the Romanian sweat and money will serve Jewry for the preparation and strengthening of their forces in the fight against us. And on the other hand, from these Romanian stages, they will serve us Romanians as spiritual nourishment, everything that will contribute to our national demoralization and moral decadence and destruction. It was the duty of others, namely the government or any authority or the professors, to take a stance against this new anti-Romanian attack, but none was taken. Only youth reacted as best as it could, risking blows, being showered with countless insults, finding nowhere any support. The struggle was pursued in every town, Husi, Bariad, Botosani, Pescani, etc., by the group of Asian students who were everywhere, held by high school students. They entered halls full of Jews, throwing at Satan's artists anything they could grab, thus chasing them off the Romanian stage. Perhaps some may say in an uncivilized manner. I too say perhaps. However, how civilized is it that an alien nation dispossess me, one after the other, of all the goods of my country? How civilized is it that the same nation poison my culture, then serve it on stage to kill me? To what extent were the means used by Jews in Russia civilized? How civilized is it to slaughter millions of people without trial? To what extent is it civilized to set fire to churches or to transform them into cabarets? For myself and my poverty, and with my poor powers, I defend myself against an assault as best as I can, by the printed word if I can, with the aid of authorities, if they are still Romanian, by a word if someone listens, by force as a last resort, and if everyone keeps quiet. Unworthy a traitor is he who does not defend his country, either because of selling out or because of innate cowardice, or does not react in any fashion. Anyway, this fight was a protest, the only protest in the center of a cowardly and terrifying silence. Next day our comrades returned with full blows and wounds, for it was no easy matter for a group of 15 youths to enter a theater with 3,000 or 4,000 Jews, and particularly they returned borne down with the opprobrium and invectives from our Romanians. Many a time I asked myself what kept us going, such a small group. Faced with so many blows, so many rebukes heaped upon us from all directions, we found support nowhere. In this fight against everybody, we found the only support in ourselves, in our belief that we were on the great path of our national destiny, side by side with all those who fought, suffered, and died as martyrs for our land and its people. Great passage. Now we're getting to the next part, titled In Germany. And this is the last section of the chapter before it's over. So I returned to ISE in the fall of 1922. There I shared with my comrades an old thought of mine, that going to Germany to continue my studies in political economy, while at the same time trying to realize my intention of carrying out our ideas and beliefs abroad. We realized very well, on the basis of our studies, that the Jewish problem had an international character, and the reaction therefore should have an international scope, that a total solution of this problem could not be reached except through action by all Christian nations awakened to the consciousness of the Jewish menace. But I had neither money nor clothing. My comrades got me some clothes and borrowed the sum of 8,000 li, which I don't know how much that's worth now, from Grigor Bezhin, which they were to repay monthly, each contributing according to his ability. With this money I left for Berlin, accompanied to the station by all those from whom I parted, who now were staying behind at home to fight on. Once arrived in Berlin, 2 students, who were also friends, Balan and C. Zada, were of great help. I registered at the university. On registration day, I donned my national costume and went to the beautiful ceremony wherein the rector, following an old tradition, shakes the hand of each new registrant. In the university's halls, I was the subject of general curiosity because of my Romanian costume. 2 questions in particularly might interest the reader of these lines regarding Germany of 1922, a look at the general situation and the status of anti-Semitic movements. The wounds left by the war just ended in defeat were still so bleeding. Material misery blanketed both Berlin and the rest of the country alike. Lately, the Ruhr Valley, an important center of riches, had been occupied too. I was witnessing the vertiginous and catastrophic downfall of the Mark. In the working men's quarters, lack of bread, lack of foodstuffs, lack of work. Hundreds of children were accosting passer-byers, begging. The fall of the Mark also threw the German aristocracy into the same misery. People who had money in a few days were left penniless. Those who sold their land and real estate holdings, being attracted to the mirage of high prices, became impoverished in the course of a few weeks. Domestic and foreign Jewish capitalists closed colossal business deals. Those possessing strong currency became owners of huge buildings of 50 apartments for only a few $100s. Speculators combed through the entire city, scoring formidable coups. Sharing this great misery were also several foreigners, among them myself, for I had no money at all. The 8,000 li I came with were spent. Then began hunger, but in the midst of general suffering, your own suffering is easier to bear. Being a type who does not bend easily faced by difficulties, I did not submit to misery, but I tried to fight it. I studied all possibilities and decided to engage in commerce. I needed a very little capital to procure a stock of food items in the country, bring them into Berlin, and sell them to restaurants. This fact made me move to Jena before the holidays, where life was cheaper. There, in the midst of the misery in which the German people struggled, I was impressed by the spirit of discipline, the capacity for labor, sense of duty, rectitude, power of resistance, and the faith in better ways, in better days. It was a healthy people, and I could see it would not permit itself to be knocked down, and that it would, with unsuspected powers, resurrect itself from under the rock with all the difficulties burdening it. The anti-Semitic movement. There was in Germany several anti-Semitic political and doctrinaire organizations with papers, manifestos, insignia, but all of them feeble. Students in Berlin, as those in Jena, were divided in hundreds of associations and numbered very few anti-Semites. The student mass knew the problem but vaguely. One could not talk of an anti-Semitic student action or even of a doctrinaire orientation similar to that of IASI. I had many discussions with the students at Berlin in 1922, who are certainly Hitlerites today, and I am proud to have been their teacher in anti-Semitism, exporting to them the truths I learned at IASI. Of Adolf Hitler, I heard for the first time around the middle of October 1922. I had gone from a worker in North Berlin, with whom I established a good relationship, who was making swastikas. His name was Strumpf, and he lived at 3 Salzwedler Strasse. He told me, quote, "It is said that an anti-Semitic movement has been started in München by a 36-year-old painter, Hitler. It seems to me he is the man we Germans have been waiting for," unquote. The foresight of this worker was fulfilled. I always admired his intuitive powers by which he could select with the antennae of his soul a stranger among scores of men. 10 years before his time, the one who would succeed in 1933, uniting under a single great command of the entire German people. It is also in Berlin and about the same time that I heard the news of the huge fascist eruption, the march on Rome and Mussolini's victory. I rejoiced as if it were my own country's victory. There is among all those in various parts of the world who serve their people a kinship of sympathy, as there is such a kinship among those who labor for the destruction of peoples. Mussolini, the brave man who trampled the dragon underfoot, was one of us. That is why all dragon heads hurl themselves upon him, swearing death to him. For us, the others, he will be a bright north star giving us hope, but he will be living proof that the Hydra can be defeated, proof of the possibilities of victory. Quote, "But Mussolini is not anti-Semitic. You rejoice in vain," unquote, whispered the Jewish press in our ears. It is not a matter of what we rejoice in, say I. It is a question of why you Jews are sad at his victory, if he is not anti-Semitic. What is the rationale of the worldwide attack on him by the Jewish press? Italy has as many Jews as Romania has Siangi, which is a very small ethnic group in Romania, in the Siret Valley. An Italian anti-Semitic movement would be as if Romanians started a movement against the Siangi. But had Mussolini lived in Romania, he could not but be anti-Semitic. For fascism means first of all defending your nation against the dangers that threaten it. It means the destruction of these dangers and the opening of a free way to life and glory for your nation. In Romania, fascism could only mean the elimination of the dangers threatening the Romanian people, namely the removal of the Jewish threat and the opening of a free way to the life and glory to which Romanians are entitled to aspire. Judaism has become the master of the world through Masonry, and in Russia through communism. Mussolini destroyed at home these two Judaic heads which threatened death to Italy, communism and Masonry. There, Judaism was eradicated through its two manifestations. In our country, will have to be eradicated through what it has there: Jews, communists, and Masons. These are the thoughts that we, Romanian youth in general, oppose to Judaic endeavors to deprive us of joy in Mussolini's victory. That's the end of Chapter 1. Thanks for listening, guys. I will be hosting this on VNN Forums, where you can find a bunch of other great audiobooks by Alex Linder. And I hope to have Chapter 2 out sometime in the near future, but who knows? Knows. 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 Knows.